There's something broken in how we raise children today, and I don't think it started with smartphones or social media. In this first episode, we're going to be pulling on one of those threads. Why did we stop using corporal punishment entirely? And what does that decision really cost us? Plus, some news I can't ignore, and a letter I shouldn't have to write. All that today on the Restless Signal. Welcome to the Restless Signal, where we seek truth, wrestle with meaning, and strive to live well. I'm the voice of the signal, and together, we're tuning in. Today's episode might ruffle some feathers, but that's not my goal. My goal is to tell the truth as plainly as I can, as a father who is trying, and sometimes failing, to raise good kids in a chaotic world. Spanking and corporal punishment were once normal forms of parental discipline. Then they became controversial, and finally, they're now practically taboo. Many professionals even lumping them into child abuse, which all reasonable parents rightly condemn. For nearly 80 years, we've been told that spanking is harmful, that it teaches violence, damages trust, and has no place in a healthy home. The experts were clear, so we largely stopped. But now, after decades of their advice, shaping schools, parenting, and public policy, we need to ask the one question that really matters. Did it work? Because if we're honest, the real world results, skyrocketing youth anxiety, broken authority in the classroom, narcissism in children, an entire generation struggling with self control, aren't just unfortunate. They're the predictable outcomes of a worldview that replaced parental wisdom built on generations of success with ideology. The so called experts claim to know better than our ancestors, and they made careers, reputations, and fortunes by trashing the practical wisdom that had guided families across cultures for centuries. I'm a father, and I'm a citizen, not a theorist. This show is about seeking truth, wrestling with meaning, and figuring out what we must do to live well. So my fidelity isn't to my standing amongst my professional peers or to the defense of a pet theory that I've been pushing. My only goal is to raise good children and contribute to a community worth living in. So in this episode, we're going to take a hard look at the guidance that told us to abandon spanking and a hard look at the profession that gave that advice and ask whether we were wrong to listen. So, let's get into it. Let's begin with my own journey on this subject because this isn't theoretical to me, this is personal. My wife and I, we have 4 children, and we deliberately chose not to spank. We were persuaded by the modern advice, that spanking, even when done infrequently, only for rather serious matters, and even when done lightly, we're certainly not talking about abuse here. We're not talking about leaving bruises, leaving welts. We're talking about a light spanking that causes no immediate or long-term harm. That we were told that could cause unseen psychological harm, and we bought into it. We bought into it that it teaches that violence is acceptable, and that fundamentally it's just philosophically wrong. That even a light swat that causes no injury still kind of violates their dignity and integrity as a person. And so for our first 2 sons, we didn't spank ever. We committed to using modern discipline techniques such as timeouts, natural consequences, using charts, reward systems, conversations after the emotions have calmed down, explaining what they did was wrong and why and what a better alternative it was. And we really bought into the 1, 2, 3 magic system. If anybody's familiar with that, it's a pretty popular book that teaches counting, employs technique and natural consequences as an alternative to spanking. And we did this for years, and I would say the results are kind of mixed at best. I mean, I've got good kids. I love them. They're great kids, but certainly discipline in our household is a real challenge, and I can certainly see as they get older, back talking and defiance more than I would have expected, and certainly more than I did. And I kind of blame failing to establish ourselves as a more credible authority figure with a real, almost, for lack of a better word, danger, a little bit backing it up. But I think this is being especially pronounced with our younger daughters, particularly my third child. She is more strong-willed than my boys were at that age, and less about getting what she wants or misbehavior, but more asserting herself and asserting power, and just trying to test boundaries, and to show that nothing we can do gets to her, that the timeout is irrelevant, that losing the natural consequences is irrelevant to her, being yelled at her is irrelevant to her, that we're not going to tell her what to do, she's going to do what she wants. And so that kind of a strong-willed child, I think, really tests the theoretical framework that these systems are built upon. And that behavior doesn't really respond well to gentle correction. So we're struggling with that now. I think we're getting a handle on it, but what I'm really concerned about is if we don't do a better job with all of our kids, and especially this one in particular, establishing ourselves as credible authority figures to be respected in their minds as children, how will that translate to them respecting and listening to us and crediting our guidance when they become older kids? How is it going to play out when they're 13, 15, 17, when they're bigger, stronger, even stronger willed, have more independence, more influences outside the home that are challenging our worldview. And frankly, their problems are much bigger, and the consequences are much bigger than the issues that we're dealing with today. So I think this is vitally important that we get this right, and we're rethinking my approach. So now that you know the personal stakes, I think it's important for us to kind of step back and say, how did we get here? Really, because spanking and corporal punishment were commonplace. I mean, it was just basically that's how it was done. And I'm not just talking about in the 20th century or in the 19th century. This has been since time immemorial. Corporal punishment has been used. It's been mentioned in the Bible in the Old Testament. So we're now talking about thousands of years. We're talking cross-culture. Corporal punishment and spanking have been used, not just in the Western world, but in Africa, Asia. So this is very common. It's very old, and I would argue it worked. It certainly helped our societies become what they were, move from being nomadic Stone Age into what we can do and accomplish today. So certainly something was working at kind of forming children into productive adults. But that really changed in the 20th century. In 1946, a Dr. Benjamin Spock published a seminal work called The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care. And frankly, I would argue was maybe anything but common sense in hindsight. Just to kind of sum it up quickly, kind of encouraged a more permissive style of parenting over kind of this, maybe the more strict approach to parenting that was common in the day, and really warned against spanking and kind of rigid rules. And over time, this philosophy has become, basically the mainstream expert opinion on the subject. Psychologists like Elizabeth Gershoff kind of continued the work and has claimed that spanking is linked to aggression, anxiety, and antisocial behavior. And frankly, I think the flaw with that, and a lot of the similar studies that claim to show this, is that it's really kind of a category error where they're mixing in spanking, the light spanking that we're talking about that causes no immediate or longer injury. So I want to make sure that we're distinguishing between the two, because I don't think they did. And if they controlled for that, they might see some things differently. And then other psychologists like T. Barry Brazelton encouraged using emotional validation over punishment. And certainly I don't believe in cold parenting, but I think that we're seeing the results of that today, where emotional validation and no discipline have really kind of poisoned several generations now. And then Diana Baumrind basically argued for warmth and structure, which kind of sounds good in theory, but I think it's been misused to promote again the soft parenting that we're seeing with today. And these psychologists, these and thinkers and others basically have pushed this out, and the professional associations have taken up the banner, and really now all physicians, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists basically buy into these presuppositions. The American Psychological Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics, amongst others, now officially condemn spanking as harmful. They claim that spanking teaches violence, damages self-esteem, and is developmentally harmful even in moderation. So that's where they're coming from. But I think us as parents, we ultimately have the responsibility to discipline our children, and to employ the technique that is calibrated to be the most successful at making them happy, secure, healthy, well-adjusted children, and grow into the same as adults. And so I think it is worth now asking, now that it's been almost 80 years since Dr. Spock's works have been published, whether that's true. We should start to see the results. Did outcomes improve? I would argue no, that they've worsened. So again, let's look at the statistics. The psychologists were successful at reducing spanking dramatically. In the 1960s, according to surveys, over 90% of American parents use spanking as a discipline method. Over 90%. Today, surveys show that less than 35% overall use spanking, and only 14% of college-educated parents report using it. And I think we're seeing that the results reflect poorer outcomes across the board and not better outcomes. So in the 1960s classroom, order was the norm. I think all of us know that. Teachers had much more authority to kind of maintain order and good behavior than they do today. I think that's self-evident. And if you talk to anyone who went to school in the era and compare and contrast it to now, they would definitely say it's night and day in terms of not just the teacher's authority and their ability to enforce norms, but in the actual behavior of the students as a result has been much worse. And today, teachers, a survey that I see from 2022, 80% of public schools report more disruption, more defiance, and more misbehavior than before. And teachers frequently cite lack of respect and loss of control as top challenges. So that's obviously a problem. And then we're seeing it also in our kids. We're supposed to be forming better kids with better mental health. Then why are we seeing the exact opposite? So a 2021 study from the CDC reported that 44% of teens report persistent sadness or hopelessness. 1 in 3 teen girls seriously considered suicide. And self-harm, anxiety, depression are all sharply up over the last 20 years. So, these are not normal fluctuations. These are, I would say, a society level failures amongst our kids, teenagers, and young adults. And I wouldn't say that spanking is the only root cause of it, but certainly, taking away strong structured parenting is not helping things. And we're also seeing academic decline. So the NAEP, the nation's report card, shows that reading and math scores have dropped significantly since the early 2000s. And that's just shocking to me because, I was around in the early 2000s. That was not the golden era of American academic achievement. This dropping test scores and not mastering the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, that has been a concern now for generations. I believe that was one of the impetuses of establishing the Department of Education in the late 1970s by Jimmy Carter. So to see that the scores are dropping in the basic subjects from the 2000s is shocking, to say the least. And students, another data point is students increasingly are struggling with focus, attention, and self-regulation. And I wouldn't attribute all of that to spanking, lack of spanking, but I certainly would say that it's definitely not helping that parents are not imposing structure, boundaries, and enforcing those boundaries in the home with effective discipline up to and including corporal punishment. And we're seeing the rise in narcissism and self-centeredness. Young people score higher on narcissism scales than previous generations, according to the same psychologists that we have some concerns with. So there's a bit of irony in me kind of quoting their statistics, but it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, I suppose. And that parenting that avoids consequences and over-validates feelings is playing a major role. So, again, looking at all these different data points, if the experts were right that corporal punishment and spanking would harm kids, then taking it away we should show better outcomes, should we not? But the results show the opposite of that. We see moral confusion, entitlement, and emotional fragility on a massive scale. And every day there are dozens and dozens of videos posted to X and other online platforms showing children, teenagers, and adults behaving completely out of control, throwing absurd fits at McDonald's or at schools or other public places, destroying public property, getting into brawls. I mean, these aren't isolated instances. They're everywhere. I mean, there are so many videos you could watch them all day and not see them all. And it's obvious many of these people behave this way because they lacked real authority in the home, often a strong father figure that lovingly but firmly established and enforced boundaries that helped instill emotional regulation in these people. Now, again, while I'm not simplistically claiming that the lack of spanking is the sole root cause for everything that we're seeing, I certainly think it's one of them. And proof is in the pudding. The so-called experts' theories were wrong, and we're now all living with the fallout of it. Why should we have trusted psychology anyways? How did they establish themselves as an expert on this topic? Why did parents give them influence over such an important decision as to what discipline tools to employ in the formation of their children? Because when you look at the track record, it's a field that is better at branding and marketing than real results at what it claims to be trying to do. So let's first talk about this. Psychology and psychiatry, they are not reliable sciences. They're more, in my opinion, more like ideology or philosophy. And that's bared out by a lot of issues here. So, for example, a 2015 study showed that only 36% of psychological studies could be replicated reliably. And so what does that mean? In science, being able to replicate the results of another scientist's experiment is one of the hallmarks to give a credence and trustworthiness to their claims, right? If someone else can't employ your methodology on the same thing and come up with similar results, then there's obviously a problem with your methodology or your conclusions, and that if that's happening largely across the board as it relates to psychology, then the whole field should be in question. Moreover, many of these famous experiments we learn about, for example, the Stanford prison experiment, where students played the role of either prisoners or prison guards, and we started to see like psychopathic and sadistic behaviors on the prison guards. Those were totally collapsed upon review, but yet they're still out there. The field relies upon murky data and information at best. It often reports on self-reported data that is unreliable, right? I mean, you're asking someone how they feel, like even if they're being truthful for you, how one person would describe how they feel versus another has got to be very difficult to be able to measure accurately. They also often come with loose correlations, and they often rely upon concepts that can't be falsified, meaning there's no way to prove they're not true. How can you trust it? Such as these explanations around trauma, repression, or unconscious bias. These are all kind of conclusions or assertions that are very difficult, if not impossible, to be falsified. And something that I think is perhaps even more problematic is the profession seems to be captured by the patient. That is a dynamic that I think is very unhealthy and disordered. As a former prosecutor, I've seen this firsthand. I often saw what seemed to be that the psychologist, who was supposed to be a neutral arbiter of the truth, employed by the court to get to the bottom of whether this person was sane or whether they're competent to stand trial, apparently being captured by the patient, by over familiarity, over sympathy for them, rather than the victims of crime and the broader society that would be further victimized by criminals. And the thing was, there'd be so many defendants who'd be found to be incompetent to stand trial or criminally insane. But I would read the police report. I would read the psychologist's testimony or their report. I spoke to witnesses and watched the video of the defendant, and I observed the defendant in court. By and large, these were not people that appeared to be crazy in any ordinary, reasonable sense that you and I would normally think of when you see kind of a raving lunatic that can't control themselves and is dangerous to himself and others. That's what we think of as an insane person. But that is not the definition and the standard that the psychologist employs, and it's often used, I think, whether intentionally or as a unfortunate side effect, to really isolate a number of criminals from their conduct and really is taking advantage of the system. And I think it's enabled by a professional class of psychologists and psychiatrists that use vague criteria, therapeutic jargon, and just ultimately are captured by their sympathy for the patient and not the victims, to ultimately evade responsibility. And just give one example of how absurd it gets. The Tyree Smith case was really in the news earlier this year, and let me give you some details about this case because it's shocking. In December 2011, Tyree Smith murdered Angel Gonzalez with a hatchet in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Later, Smith confessed to eating parts of Gonzalez's brain and an eyeball while drinking sake. So in 2013, Smith was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and instead of going to a prison for the rest of his life where he belongs, if not receive the death penalty, he was committed to a hospital for up to 60 years. If that's not bad enough, in February 2025, the Connecticut Psychiatric Security Review Board granted Smith a conditional release, citing his schizophrenia and substance use disorders were in remission due to medication and treatment. The decision was based in part on Smith's self-reporting that he no longer has a desire to eat human flesh and that he would inform authorities if such tendencies returned. And unsurprisingly, Gonzalez's family and lawmakers, as well as pundits nationwide, expressed deep concern over this release and questioned the safety of the public and the adequacy of the evaluation. This case is just so absurd that I think it's just a great example, but certainly not the only example. We could probably take up hour after hour talking about cases like this, but it's just the end state that modern mainstream psychology and the psychologists that practice it, and exposes that they have no real claim to real expertise or good judgment for what is best for the world, for what's best to society, and certainly shouldn't be relied upon to help us decide what to do to form happy, well-adjusted, and kind children that would become capable and responsible citizens as adults. So given that we see that the modern advice doesn't seem to be working and the modern experts really don't have the expertise that they claim to have, or really maybe even our best interests at heart, we now have to ask, well, what does work and what should we do instead? I think it starts with trusting yourself again. Don't divorce your judgment and outsource it to authority figures. You are the parent. You have eyes, ears. You're a capable person. And it's your responsibility and your duty to figure this out. And rely upon some of the practical wisdom that worked for thousands of years, and rather than the new age vote that never was tested and the real results kind of betray that it was based upon theory and not wisdom. So once we've kind of reclaimed the right to trust our own judgment and to see what's true with our own eyes, I think that we next need to reclaim the moral authority in the home. We need to be clear, we need to be calm, but we've got to be in charge. And that means that we draw the boundaries and we enforce them consistently and clearly and with real consequence. We have to use structure, we have to use love, but yes, real consequence to make sure. We need to provide a routine. They need chores. They need expectations. They need our attention, both the loving and the disciplinary type. But they need that all. And we need to stop this constant negotiation, the endless negotiation, the endless appeal to their better nature. We need to be the parent that enforces the rule. And yes, that means that we accept that light spanking, not abuse, light spanking, to be clear, has a place in the discipline and formation of good children. I don't think it should be your primary tool, but I think it's a backup. I think it's a backup tool for serious instances of defiance, especially for use with strong-willed children, to really get the point home when the other more mild form of consequences is not working. Again, the goal isn't domination, but it's being clear, being calm, and administering a fair but meaningful consequence consistently in a way that works. And just to sum up, I think this idea that the momentary sting to the backside of a child is more damaging than months, if not years, or an entire childhood of passive chaos in the home, of boundaries being set and constantly seeing that they can be violated without real consequence, is absurd. That is what damages a child. The absence of boundaries that are enforced, and not a mild sting. And I think we all know that. Many of us grew up this way. So to wrap up, spanking was discouraged by a profession that I think the results, as well as the methodology itself, shows that we simply should not have ever trusted. It's a profession that's riddled with ideological bias, failed studies, absurd conclusions, and no real accountability when their theories don't work. They've told us to do what to do for decades, but the results speak for themselves. We're not raising stronger, wiser, more peaceful children. We're raising fragile, angry, self-absorbed kids who lash out, collapse under pressure, and treat consequences as oppression. The tools that shape generations, and ourselves oftentimes, tools that were grounded in love, structure, and yes, occasional firm correction, weren't abandoned because they failed. They were abandoned because they didn't fit a theory that made people rich and famous. But parenting doesn't happen in theory. It happens in kitchens, in parking lots, in late night conversations after hard days. It happens every time a child tests the line and a parent decides whether or not to hold to it. We've got to return to what worked for generations and what worked for us. We've got to reject the theory and remember what we've seen and lived. We have to trust our own eyes and reclaim the right and the duty to raise our children with real consequences, with a real authority and a real love. Because our duty is not to please experts. It's to raise good people, strong enough to bear burdens, kind enough to love others, and wise enough to live in truth. And that requires more than technique, more than theory. It requires courage, clarity, and faithfulness to our children. Not to the theory of the weak, but faithfulness to what is good. Let's turn to our next segment, which I'm calling the Bulletin. In each episode, I'll take you through 3 to 5 current news stories and give you my take. Now, this show isn't primarily about politics or headlines, but I live in this world just like you, and I care deeply about it, and more importantly, the people in it. So it feels not just natural, but necessary to seek truth, wrestle with meaning, and figure out how we're supposed to live well, especially in light of what is happening right now. And look, it probably won't surprise you, especially after the last segment, but I tend to lean conservative politically. I'm not going to hide that to appease anyone. I respect myself, and I respect the listeners too much for that. Plus, and more importantly, it wouldn't be true. And being grounded in truth, that's what this whole project is about. But make no mistake, I don't have tribal loyalties. I just want to do what's right, consistent with my values. And that means sometimes I'm going to be criticizing the people I usually agree with. Now, I don't expect you to agree with me all the time. Nobody should. But I hope you'll see that I care, and that I'm thinking seriously about these things, and that I'm doing my best to tell the truth and wrestle with meaning as honestly as I can. Now, with that, let's jump into our first one. For our first item over the wire, last week President Trump made headlines when Qatar gifted a luxury Boeing 747-8 aircraft worth a reported $400 million to be used temporarily as Air Force One. The administration says the plane is intended for government use and may eventually be donated to Trump's presidential library. Qatar called it a gesture of goodwill. The Democrats and the mainstream media, predictably, called it corruption. Now, here's my take. First, I'm going to put the legality of this off to the side. Plenty of people will be chasing that angle, and I just assume the administration's lawyers will structure this in a way that at least makes it facially legal. Now, that doesn't mean there's no problem with it, but it just means I have faith that we're likely not going to get a clean emolument clause violation here. But again, I'll let other people look into the technicalities. Second, I don't buy into the mainstream media's outrage machine over this one. They always blow everything Trump does out of proportion, and they tend to selectively ignore questionable dealings from the other side. Think about the Clinton Foundation or the Hunter Biden laptop story. So yeah, the double standard is real, and it's tiring. But here's where I really land on the substance of this. It still bothers me. Not because I think Trump is secretly doing Qatar's bidding, but just because it's unnecessary. The government already has planes. I think we have like 2 that we use as Air Force One. And I know Trump likes nice things, but tough. You're the president, not a brand ambassador. And this gift, it gifts wrap the Trump is corrupt narrative on a silver platter. Why hand your critics ammunition you don't need to give them right now, especially when we're trying to get important things done? And let's be honest, nobody gives someone a $400 million plane without hoping to get something out of it. Whether Trump would be influenced by it or not is actually beside the point. The very appearance of influence is enough to undermine trust. In ethics, that matters. Actual conflicts of interest or just the appearance of conflicts, either one can erode credibility. And finally, is this even practical? I remember watching a documentary about how the Secret Service tears apart every presidential limo delivered from GM just to make sure it's not bugged. You think Qatar's luxury jet is going to pass that test easily? This ultimately just opens up a security of can of worms, invites more scrutiny than it's worth, and it's probably going to take forever and cost a fortune. And for what? A cooler ride? A better banner photo on Truth Social? Look, I generally support Trump, but I think this was a swing and a miss. The juice just isn't going to be worth a squeeze. For our second bulletin story, over the weekend, a tragic and frankly disturbing incident occurred in New York Harbor. The Mexican Navy's training ship, Cuauhtémoc, drifted backwards into the Brooklyn Bridge after reportedly losing power while departing from Pier 17. Its towering mast struck the underside of the bridge, snapping on impact. And this is what made it so shocking. From the footage I saw, there appeared to be dozens of cadets standing on those masts, performing a ceremonial farewell, high in the air, when the mast came crashing down what looked like hundreds of feet. Reportedly, 2 cadets were killed and nearly 20 others were injured, some critically. And again, from the footage I saw, this wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It wasn't like a hurricane. The ship was drifting pretty slowly. And of course, the bridge was in plain view. I mean, this is the Brooklyn Bridge we're talking about. It's huge. And yet there are still cadets apparently standing up there, high in the air. Now, I want to be fair. I wasn't there. I'm not a sailor. I don't know every detail. Maybe they did try to get people down, and maybe there really wasn't time to evacuate everyone. But if that's true, then that's kind of the problem. If you can't get your people to safely quickly in an emergency, then you shouldn't be putting them in that position, especially not in a crowded port with hard infrastructure all around you. These aren't Marines storming a beach to take an objective. These are cadets on a peacetime training ship. They should have been a clear, immediate plan for how to respond if the control of the ship was lost. And if the answer is, well, we never expected this to happen, Frankly, would say that's unacceptable. It's not crazy to imagine a ship losing helm control, and it's not crazy to imagine something going wrong in a tight harbor. And if a ceremonial tradition puts your crew hundreds of feet in the air on narrow platforms with no margin for error, then you'd better have a fail-safe way to get them down fast. At the end of the day, get it, tradition has value, ceremony has meaning. But when it gets people hurt or killed for no reason, it's time to rethink your priorities. And for our last story, this past Monday, the U.S. and China agreed to a 90-day truce on tariffs. The deal dramatically cut duties. U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports dropped from 145% to 30%, and China lowered its tariffs on American goods from 125% to 10%. The move had markets cheering and some commentators calling it a diplomatic win. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the right approach to tariffs is, honestly, and we'll probably have to come back to this topic in more depth in a future episode. But for now, I'll say this. I think the media's selective outrage about prices going up is often overblown and disingenuous. They panic over the cost of goods fluctuating, but never ask what it costs a country to stop making things altogether. Because here's the reality. We're not just an economy. We're a country where people live, and a country needs to produce. We can't be a nation of spreadsheets and service workers and expect to stay strong. And while I respect economists like Milton Friedman, I just don't agree that efficiency is the highest good. We need to make things in America. But perhaps more importantly, people need meaningful occupations, not just for the paycheck, but for the sense of identity, purpose, and dignity that it brings. That matters. And while I generally lean conservative, I'm not a pure hands-off guy. I actually have a lot of sympathy for the old Henry Clay American system. The idea that the government should strengthen national industries, build infrastructure, and protect the conditions for families and communities to thrive. And I just don't have faith in ideologies. My faith is in God. Ideologies are just tools, useful when they serve the common good, dangerous when they become articles of faith. A country that can't feed itself, power itself, or defend itself because it outsourced everything to save a buck, that's not freedom. That's dependency, and that's a disaster waiting to happen. So, yeah, we'll dig deeper on this in a future episode. But I think it's time we stop asking, is this policy efficient? And start asking, is this policy faithful to the people it's meant to serve? All right, that's it for the bulletin. Let's move on. All right, let's shift gears for a moment. If you know me in real life, you know that I have this kind of quirk. I like to write letters, or at least I think I do. Not like Hallmark cards or thank you notes, although I certainly send those. I mean the kind of letter you compose in your head. Furious, eloquent, fully reasoned, when you're standing in line at a government office or navigating some corporate policy so stupid it makes your eye twitch. I rarely send them. I usually just don't end up having the time, although I do sometimes. But I'll often vent to my family or to my friends, and it's become kind of a running joke. Here comes another letter he's never going to send. So this segment, which will be recording one on the show, is in that spirit. It's called A Letter I Shouldn't Have to Write, but apparently I do. And today, it's addressed to a touchscreen. Dear tablet that asked me for a tip before I even got my coffee. I stood still, you stood still. The barista tapped the screen, spun it towards me, and suddenly I was staring down a moral judgment interface. 20%, 25%, 30%, and other in case I want to admit I'm a terrible person. What exactly am I tipping for? The act of tapping a touchscreen and handing me a paper cup? The 3.4 seconds of eye contact before my name was mispronounced? Now, let me be clear. I've done these jobs. I worked in restaurants. I worked in retail. I maintained dressing rooms and refolded shirts after customers tore through the racks. I stood all day behind a cash register. I seated people, brought them their drinks and breadsticks, rolled silverware, wiped tables, washed menus, and I did all of that wearing a dress shirt and a tie. Funny enough, the chain restaurant uniform in the year 2000 was more professional than what most corporate employees wear today. So I'm not speaking from ignorance. I respect people doing these jobs. In fact, I was those people. And I'm glad when I see folks working hard and contributing. But that doesn't mean a tip is warranted. A tip should reward excellent service, not routine participation in a basic transaction. We've all lost clarity about what tipping is even for. Why does a barista deserve a tip, but the grocery store cashier doesn't? When I worked retail, I had to fold every item, wrap fragile goods in a paper bag, pack bags neatly, and do it all with a line of impatient customers. That was real effort. But no one offered me 20% on top of the $8 an hour. And speaking of 20%, when did that become the floor? Tipping used to start at 10%. Then it was 15%. Now, if you pick anything less than 20%, you're basically a war criminal. And worse, the default percentage now seems to apply after sales tax. So now I'm tipping not just for the labor and the price of the good, but for the sales tax imposed by the government? Why? Meanwhile, I don't get tipped at my job. Most people don't. We just do our jobs. Doing a good job is expected. I don't invoice my colleagues for extra kindness or charge my company a 25% gratuity for not screwing up. And that's true for most people. But somehow those of us who busted our butts to build something, who've left the minimum wage world behind, who now work stressful white-collar jobs to support their families, we're the ones getting shaken down at every turn. High taxes, tipping tablets, GoFundMe's at checkout, 5 different church fundraisers on top of the regular offering. I work hard. I have a family of 6 to support. Yes, I have a good job, but it didn't land in my lap. It took years of pressure, stress, and discipline, and it still does. And sure, from the outside, I may look like someone who can afford to tack on an extra 20% everywhere I go, but I have obligations too. Big ones. Supporting a family isn't cheap. Providing stability takes everything I've got, mentally, emotionally, financially. And the part that really gets me, I'm not even getting anything new in return. Yes, I still tip well when the service is real, but now I'm tipping well for nothing. Just for showing up, for handing me a paper bag. Somehow a whole layer of tipping has been added on top of normal transactions, and we all just accepted it. But it's not a reward anymore. It's essentially a social tax. So no, I don't have money laying around to grease every interaction out of guilt. And forgive me, but I'm tired of being emotionally blackmailed by every touchscreen I meet. Look, I'm not mad at the barista. I appreciate them, and I've done that kind of work. But I'm frustrated with a culture that makes tipping feel like a social minefield and forced compliance, instead of a voluntary gesture of true gratitude for exceptional service like it's supposed to be. So bring back the tip jar. Let me throw in a buck because I want to, not because the touchscreen stared me down and asked if I'd like to be generous in front of an audience. Shouldn't have to write this letter, but if I'm going to be guilt-tripped over a muffin, I'd at least need to keep my dignity and my change. Sincerely, a guy who tips well, but doesn't like doing it for standing still. Before we wrap up, I want to introduce a recurring segment called Reasons for Hope. At the end of every episode, I'll share a story that reminds us the world isn't just on fire. Sometimes it's quietly healing. These are the stories I want to carry with me, and maybe you will too. This episode's Reason for Hope comes from the world of pediatric cancer research. In December 2024, researchers from the Children's Oncology Group, working across hospitals like Seattle Children's and Sick Kids in Toronto, announced a major breakthrough in treating B-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common form of childhood cancer. In a global clinical trial involving more than 4,200 children, they tested the addition of a targeted immunotherapy drug, blinatumomab. Yes, that's a real word, and that's actually how it's pronounced. I triple-checked. To the standard chemotherapy regimen. The result? The 3-year disease-free survival rate rose from 88 to 96%. That may sound like a small increase, but in human terms, it means tens of thousands more children surviving, tens of thousands more families spared unbearable loss, tens of thousands more lives with a chance to unfold. In a world that can often feel dark and bleak, we hear the news that hard work, collaboration, and human ingenuity are helping save tens of thousands of sick kids. They'll get to grow up, find their voice, and bring a spark of God's love into the world. And if that isn't a reason for hope, I don't know what is. That's it for today's show. Thanks for tuning in to our very first full episode. We'll try to be transmitted again soon. Until then, seek truth, wrestle with meaning, live well. And above all, keep your signal clear. You've been listening to the Restless Signal podcast, copyright 2025, all rights reserved. Check us out on the web at therestlesssignal.com.